Even if you haven't seen F.W. Murnau's Nosferatu, it's very likely its creepy buck-toothed vampire Count Orlok has influenced you in some other way. Maybe he traumatized you on SpongeBob, or you've killed him in video games, or you've seen his design copied or parodied in countless other movies and TV shows. The original film is rightly regarded as a horror classic. Although by modern standards Count Orlok isn't particularly sexy or sparkly, he paved the way for our conception of what vampires are. This movie is a personal favorite of mine. I love the creepy atmosphere and the eerie expressionist visuals. But as much as I'd love to drone on about how great it is, I think the real-life story behind Nosferatu is as fascinating as the movie itself. Nosferatu was originally released in 1922, the first project created by an ambitious new studio called Prana Film. Prana was founded a year earlier by two men who didn't have any filmmaking experience: businessman Enrico Diekmann and artist Albin Grau. The latter was an occultist and was very interested in using the studio to create supernatural films. It's said Grau got the idea of a vampire story from his time as a soldier during World War I. While stationed in Serbia, Grau supposedly heard from a peasant that his own father was a vampire. However accurate this story is, and film historians have doubted it, Diekmann and Grau eventually settled on adapting Bram Stoker's Dracula. Neither of them actually wanted to pay for the rights though, so they set out to do the cheapest and next best thing. They plagiarized the novel. But luckily for Diekmann and Grau, they knew how to pick the right people who could rip the novel off with style. To be fair, Grau was a talented artist in his own right, and his art direction was essential in creating Nosferatu's haunting visuals. Henrik Galeen, co-director and screenwriter of Der Golem, provided the script, while the great F.W. Murnau served as director. So the studio wouldn't get sued, at least ideally. Galeen carefully tweaked things so that Nosferatu would be original. He changed the setting from Victorian London to a fictional German town in 1837, for example, and he changed the names as well, most notably turning Dracula into Count Orlok. Orlok looks nothing like how we imagine Count Dracula today, but according to the novel's characteristics, Dracula also had sharp teeth and pointy ears, something Orlok shares with him. So, while the character is loosely related, and there are differences between the two vampires and their respective stories, the basic gist is the same. A man goes to Transylvania on business, runs into a vampire count, and accidentally brings the monster home with him. When Nosferatu premiered at the Berlin Zoo in March 1922, the response was mostly positive. Other than a few angry Marxists who accused the movie of promoting superstition, critics and audiences loved it. Prana Film faced two problems very early on, however. The first was that Diekmann and Grau spent a ton of money on promoting their pale, morbid love child, definitely way more than what was necessary. The second was that somebody wanted their adorable Count Orlok destroyed, and it wasn't just an angry Marxist critic. Florence Stoker, the widow of Bram Stoker, heard about Nosferatu's plagiarism after an anonymous tattletale sent her a letter about the movie's premiere. Understandably, Florence wasn't pleased that her late husband's novel was turned into a movie by a couple of German guys who were too cheap to ask for permission. Nosferatu's plagiarism was especially insulting at the time because Florence was struggling with her finances. Dracula wasn't yet the vast money-generating vampire he is today, and in the early 1920s, the royalties from the book sales weren't the best. Florence really needed whatever she could get. It was only fair that Nosferatu's filmmakers gave her a part of what little money they didn't spend on their marketing. Desperate for help, Florence joined the Society of Authors, a British organization still around today that represents professional writers. The society agreed, weakly, to assist her cause. They set Florence up with a German lawyer, and the lawyer agreed that Florence had a good case. According to German copyright law at the time, a work didn't enter the public domain until 50 years after the death of its author. On that basis, the work of Bram Stoker, having died in 1912, couldn't be freely adapted for another 40 years. Plus, even if the filmmakers tried to cover up their borrowing, it didn't help that they blatantly advertised Nosferatu as a Dracula adaptation. Maybe this sounds like the case should have been a pretty simple affair, but Florence Stoker had to put on a strong and long-winded fight against Nosferatu's parents. Prana Film was already struggling financially, and the press had scooped up some dirt about the company's mishandling of its finances. By July 1922, Prana had gone bankrupt and had liquidated the few assets it had to another scheme by Enrico Diekmann, the Deutsche Amerikanische Film Union. When Florence took the DAFU to court in 1924, the company tried to argue that it wasn't responsible for Nosferatu. Meanwhile, in February 1925, Diekman and Grau's new company, the Pan Film Studio, declared bankruptcy. Diekman and another partner stole funds, and Diekman ended up going to jail for his sleazy behavior. To my knowledge, he was never involved with filmmaking again. With the filmmakers in ruin, however, what kind of compensation could Florence possibly get now? In July 1925, after some bickering and appeals by the DAFU, the German court finally reached a conclusion. Florence wouldn't receive any money, but the court wanted to be sure that she would receive justice, German style, so it ordered all the prints of Nosferatu destroyed, including its negative. Now this was an outrageous response, and it's bizarre to think that a judge would order such an important part of film history erased without a second thought. In the 1920s though, most people didn't take film preservation seriously. Movies were released, they made money, and theaters either threw them away or stored them in vaults that were guaranteed to treat the reels like vampires in sunlight. On the other hand, this indifference toward film might have saved Nosferatu. It's often said that the movie was nearly wiped out of existence after the court ruling, preserved only by a single print. But while this claim has been repeated over and over, there's no evidence that anybody in 1925 destroyed copies of the movie. Frankly, at that point, nobody probably would have wanted to bother with what was already a relic. We know actually that there were copies still circulating after Florence's lawsuit. In fact, in October 1925, Florence was invited by the British Film Society to attend a screening of what it billed as F.W. Murnau's Dracula. As you can imagine, the name change didn't satisfy the widow, and she tried to hunt down the person who was distributing the film throughout London. She wasn't successful, and Nosferatu managed to cross the ocean and play in Detroit and New York City in 1929 under the same name. The next year, the movie was being screened in Austria, re-edited and redubbed the 12th hour. This version was made by a film producer who bought the rights from Alvin Grau. It had sound, a happy ending, old footage shot by Murnau that never made it into the original cut, and entirely new scenes shot just for this movie. The 12th hour actually still exists today, but the only complete copy is under the possession of the Cinémathèque Française, and they won't let anyone see it. Beyond the 1930s, Nosferatu was still haunting viewers in Europe and the United States, but in various different versions. Over the decades, the movie was translated from language to language, removing its color tints and changing the style of its intertitles. For later scholars and restorations, all these incisions made creating a comprehensive version quite the challenge. One popular version, that originated from a Czech copy, was an untinted print screened at the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 1947. This version is in black and white, and all the movie's characters had their German names swapped for the originals used in Stoker's novel, including calling Count Orlok Dracula. This 1947 print would tour around Europe in the 1960s, and since it's in the public domain, has been a frequent source for the movie's home video releases in the US. Fortunately, after being scrambled so long after its 1922 release, restorations since the 1980s have helped to restore F.W. Murnau's original vision to modern audiences. Nearly 100 years later, you can find Nosferatu on the internet, or on DVD, or in film classes, or even on YouTube. Despite Florence Stoker's wishes, Nosferatu likely isn't disappearing anytime soon, and world cinema is all the richer for it.